Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo, and with me today is the great Dr. Robert Lyman. Hello, Robert.
Hello, John. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
Well, it's my absolute honor. We're going to talk about today the great General Slim of the World War II Burmese theater. Before we get to that, I want to talk to you about Robert's books, which he has a number of, including Slim, Master of War, another book called The Generals, which covers a number of generals from World War II, and a fantastic book, which you can also find, A War of Empires. You can find out more about Robert at his website, robertlyman, Lyman.com. Robert, this is fantastic. This General Slim, we were kind of talking before he came on the call. I often hear him get compared to the Duke of Wellington or General Montgomery. He seems to be one of the greatest British commanders of all time, right?
Yeah, look, it's a really good way to start, which is to say, well, lots of people just don't know anything about Slim, particularly on your side of the pond. But the way to think about Slim is he's one of the 3 or 4 greatest British generals of all time, all recent times. So we need to start with Cromwell and then go to Marlborough perhaps, and his Danube campaign, down the Rhine rather, and then Haig. It's a very interesting point about Haig. He wasn't as bad as people think. He was able to engineer some quite extraordinary victories in 1918. And then Montgomery, and then you've got Slim. But if you're going to compare the recent, last couple of hundred years, I've forgotten Wellington, of course. That's 5 generals. He's certainly in the top 5. I would place him much higher this century than even on the last 100 years than Montgomery. Montgomery was a brilliant general. Slim was a genius.
Yeah, it's interesting just reading up on William Joseph Slim, born 1891 in Bristol to a lower-class middle family. An uncommon background for future British field marshal. What was his upbringing like?
His upbringing was tough. I mean, the family weren't poor, but his father was an engineer and ran a small engineering business that went bust in Bristol. And they moved up to Birmingham, north to Birmingham, which was a big industrial centre, 4 or 5 years later, 1800s, in order to find work. And money was always tight. There was only enough money. He had a brother, Charles. There was only enough money to send his brother to university. He had to leave school early and go and get a job in an engineering business. He then went and did a bit of associate teaching. Always a very, very smart man, born with oodles of brains, a very able communicator. So teaching or becoming an assistant teacher was ideal for him. But actually, the reality is, outside of the onset of war in 1914, that's where he would have ended up. He would have been a school teacher.
Funny how opportunities come up in life that kind of alter your career path.
Exactly right.
Yeah, he's commissioned during World War I and serves with distinction in the Gallipoli battles, where he's badly wounded, and the Mesopotamian campaigns. What lessons do you think Slim took from his service as a junior officer in World War I?
Well, it's worth saying, before we get to 1914, that he was always really interested in military history. He'd spent a lot of his childhood reading stories of daring do from generals and wars of the past, and he was fixated with it, and he managed to wangle himself into the officer training corps at Birmingham University, even though he wasn't entitled to be there. He, in my view, he pretended to be his brother Charles, who was at the university studying medicine, and that meant that when the First World War came, he was automatically commissioned into the Warwickshire Regiment. He was commissioned in the British Army. And he fought, as you said, with distinction in Gallipoli. He was very badly wounded. In fact, he was very lucky to survive a severe bullet wound in his chest. He came back home to the UK, eventually patched up, managed to wrangle his way back to the regiment where in 1917, or 1916 actually, he ended up in Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, got another bullet in the chest in 1917, survived that. But he was a very good soldier, and he knew he was a good soldier, and everyone around him regarded him to be a good soldier. And when I was doing my PhD 30 years ago, I met quite a number of families of men who knew him, and they all talked about him being one of those rare natural soldiers. And as we were saying before we came on the pod, these individuals are quite rare. They come up every couple of generations, men who are able to understand the techniques of fighting war, and that's everything from battles, the tactics of battles, up to campaigns and strategy, but also to coalesce the unwilling around you, because not everyone wants to go and fight, even good soldiers. I mean, I was a soldier for 20 years. There are times when you'd rather not. Slim was one of those characters who was able to bring it all together, and it's quite a rare thing. It's very hard to describe. A natural soldier is definitely one way to describe him. In terms of learning lessons, well, let's come back to that in a moment, because as a young officer, he learned that the importance was in the little things, getting the little things done. And it might sound a bit perverse, but certainly retired soldiers or anyone who's still serving will understand what I mean. Making sure your kit's ready, cleaning your rifle, making sure your grenades are primed, and you check the detonators before you put them away, ready to go on patrol. All this really, really basic stuff. Always being ready, always being clean, always being alert. Having a sharpened bayonet and not being lazy about your professional approach to soldiering. That's all stuff that he was mother's milk to him.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to bring up, because you have those natural leaders like Napoleon or the Duke of Wellington who can come into a room and command it immediately. But then you have people under them like Marshal who want you to focus on the little things. Like you said, keeping your bayonet cleaner, making sure you have enough rations for the campaign, just to make sure they're effective soldiers.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, there's a thing in the British Army where recruits are always, after a few weeks, they don't know this, but they're always given the water test, which is platoon sergeant goes along and checks their water bottles, because the first rule of soldiering is always keep your water bottle topped up. And this is something that Slim insisted on, and people aren't really aware that actually this is a tradition that began in the British Army with Slim. Always make sure if you're going on a patrol, your water bottle's topped up, because a number of times he went out into the desert and he didn't, and his soldiers didn't, and they all, they suffered from thirst first. So this is the point. It's attention to the little things, and once you pay attention to the little things when you're training, they become second nature. You can then focus on the things that really matter.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that in the jungle campaigns of Burma here in a little bit on the little things. Yeah. After the First World War, he marries Eileen Robertson. What was their marriage like?
It was remarkably strong. I mean, I know the family very well, and everyone who I didn't know her, Aileen, spoke incredibly highly of her. Their marriage was very strong. I mean, as we were saying before the pod started, he was a remarkable man. He was a very moral man. He wasn't a philanderer. There was no bed hopping of any kind, but certainly not Slim. And this wasn't because he wasn't overly religious. He wore his Roman Catholicism very lightly, but he was a moral man. He understood how societies work on the basis of trust and loyalty. And his family was very strong. They had two children, John and Una, and I was very privileged to know John very well. But a very strong marriage. She was very, very important to his success, both in India in the 1920s and 30s, and also during the war.
Yeah, it seems like he's slowly moving up the ranks. He holds the rank of captain, then is transferred to the Indian Army, and he eventually rises through the ranks, and by 1939, he's a colonel. But I also read that he wrote novels at this time to supplement his income. Is this true?
It's absolutely true. Let me just talk about his transfer to the Indian Army. It's very, very difficult. And people, just to remind people, particularly on your side of the pond, the Indian Army was very different to the British Army. When you were commissioned as a young officer, you were commissioned into either of the armies. There's no transferring from one to the other. They weren't the same thing. There is no such thing as the British Indian Army. It was the Indian Army and the British Army. And he left the British Army in 1919, resigned from the British Army, and was given a commission, a very rare event, didn't happen very often, particularly after the First World War, into the Indian Army. He joined the 6th Gurkha Rifles. And his progress up the career ladder wasn't like a rocket at all. It was very, very slow, as indeed all promotion and then between the wars was very slow. And as you say, he got to 1939, he was only a colonel. I mean, he was thinking, perhaps, certainly before the war came in 1939, that he was due to retire soon, and he would retire to an impoverished retirement somewhere in the south coast of England, as many of his peers did. So it wasn't a spectacular career, even though he was known as one of the best, probably the best talent of his peer group in the Indian Army. He came top of the Staff College at Quetta. He was then sent as the Indian Army representative to the British Staff College at Camberley. He was then the Indian Army representative at the Imperial Defence College in London. So a top flight man, but there was no promotion actually in the Indian Army at the time. It was outside of a war, this was a career that was going nowhere. He also had two children who he sent to boarding schools in the UK, and they cost a lot of money. He had a natural talent for writing, so he wrote a couple of articles in 1928 and 1929, and they were picked up by newspapers and published. He always published under a pseudonym. He didn't want his friends or colleagues in the Indian Army to know that he, Bill Slim, was writing for money. So he used this pseudonym called John Mills, which is Slim backwards. And he was very successful. And through the 1930s, he wrote in the region, I'm just trying to remember, over 50 long articles on a variety of subjects, the Indian Army, history, India, and a few whodunits. And I had the great privilege a couple of years ago of going through all of these at the Cambridge Archives, the Slim papers at the Cambridge Archive at Cambridge University, and we published them last year, and they're available. They're available online as well. So, and they're well worth it. If you're interested in Slim and you want to get into his head, these articles are absolutely fascinating. But he earned a lot of money, relatively speaking, from them, sufficient to be able to help pay school fees.
Well, I think that speaks to his upbringing. Like, this wasn't some aristocratic officer who had money to fall back on. He had to come up with extra income.
John, that's a key point that I'd almost forgotten at the start. That people need to realize that he did not come from the traditional stock of British Army officers and had no prospects of getting to senior rank. And one of the reasons he did get to colonel was he was in the Indian Army, where meritocracy was much more important and much more pertinent and significant than in the British Army. The British Army was a meritocratic organization, certainly in wartime, but less so in peace. The Indian Army is very meritocratic. Normally, Slim would not have got any higher than where he got to in peacetime, which is colonel.
Well, let's talk about that experience in India. You know, these are the inner years. How did that shape his understanding of empire, soldiers, and command? Because you have to be able to command different nationalities as a cohesive unit.
Well, precisely. One of the things people forget about the Indian Army is it was an army of many languages and peoples, and the Indian Army was actually the organization that brought India together because they all forced to coalesce together. It's one of my great arguments. The argument in my book, A War of Empires, is that the Second World War, the Indian Army came together to represent the whole of India in a new way, and quite a profound way. Slim, in order to command troops in India, you need to learn Urdu, you need to pass the appropriate language qualifications, you need to do that within 2 years of arriving in India. And a number of British people, Australians and others who went out to join the Indian Army failed to do that because they couldn't pass the language test. So what you did in the first 2 years is you employed a munshi, a teacher, who taught you every day at the end of, in the Indian Army at the time, you tended to work in the morning and you'd stop after lunch, and then the afternoon was yourself for doing this sort of stuff, which is learning the languages. And the munshi would teach you, and you would learn the language with the munshi and with your soldiers. Now, if you were in a Gurkha regiment, you had to do the army's Urdu examination. Urdu is the language that bound the army together. But it made a lot of sense as well if you were involved with the Hindu soldiers to learn Hindi as well. But if you were a Gurkha, you also then had to learn Ghakkali, which is now called Nepali. So British Army officers at the time, really proficient officers, knew Urdu and Ghakkali. The best ones knew 3 languages in addition to English, which is Hindi as well. So it's quite extraordinary, actually. You know, the idea that British officers out there were real dullards. They didn't have any brains. They didn't know, their backside from their elbow is patent nonsense. Actually, they were some of the best officers that Britain could provide, and they knew how to bring their soldiers together. So throughout the 1920s and 30s, there was a long period of rumbling dissent on the northwest frontier with the Pathan tribes, various Pathan tribes, and this gave units in particular, both of the Indian Army and the British Army, who operated separately, really good experience in what we then knew as small wars, operations against tribespeople, coordinating infantry, artillery, signals, aircraft, and so on. And it's I was brought up in a similar environment in Northern Ireland, and so that was, as an infantry officer, that was very important experience for me, where it was the little things that matter, and you focus on being a first-class soldier. And that's what the Northwest Frontier did for Slim and for countless other officers like him. So that period of time in India in the 1920s and 30s was incredibly important. And it's interesting when you look at the people who took senior command in the Second World War, all of them had been through that experience without exception. All the divisional corps commanders had spent time on the Northwest frontier.
Yeah, and anyone who's trying to learn a second language will tell you it's very difficult. But to learn 3 or 4 second languages,
I was on loan service with a foreign country for 3 years, and I had to learn that language. And goodness gracious me, that I found that very difficult.
yeah. At the outbreak of World War II, Slim is commanding Indian formations in East Africa and the Middle East. And this quote I found from Slim kind of reminds me of the Duke of Wellington. Quote, "I was, like other generals before me, to be saved by the resourcefulness and stubborn valor of my troops," end quote. So how did he perform at the beginning of World War II? Was he kind of learning on the job?
Everyone was learning on the job. That particular quote came from Kohima in 1944, and it's absolutely fantastic because it points to a significant failure that Slim was responsible for, which is the mistake of not defending Kohima. We'll come to that in a moment. But in 1940, he was promoted to brigadier and sent to command a brigade in Eritrea, what was then Abyssinia, and in order to be able to fight the Italians who had occupied the Horn of Africa. And this was clearly a new experience for him, with having 3 battalions, and one particular experience, the Battle of Gallabat, was on his account a disaster. The Gallabat fort, which was held by the Italians, wasn't captured, and a whole series of tactical mistakes were made. But the biggest mistake Slim learned from that was that you need to be bold. What you always need to consider when you're developing a plan for a campaign, then executing it, is what the enemy might be thinking or doing as well. And that's probably a more important thing for you than actually your knowledge of your own troops. Now, because you know what your troops can do and how they do it. But it's important, if you're a war gamer, you spend all your time, most of your time, you need to be sitting in the mind of the other guy, playing on their fears, working on their prejudices, trying to discombobulate them mentally so that you reduce the impact on your own troops in terms of combat. That's a really important thing. Just going into battle all the time might make you feel good, but you're going to lose troops. Attrition only goes one way. The mathematics of attrition only goes one way. And you want to be able to work out ways of defeating the enemy outside of battle or by using your forces to scare them and so on. That was his big lesson in 1940. He was promoted to the divisional commander of the 10th Indian Division, really because the divisional commander at the time had lost the confidence of his troops, the brigade commanders. Slim was promoted to major general, took over command in Iraq, and was then immediately responsible for launching a campaign against the Vichy French in Syria at Deir ez-Zor. Slim had to come up with a campaign plan to attack Deir ez-Zor, and he had none of the resources that the French had. The French army in Syria was particularly well equipped with large numbers of troops. So Slim had to work out a way of putting his very sharp knife into the body of this enemy and being decisive about it. He decided that he'd do it by threatening the front of Deir ez-Zor and then attacked from the rear. It was a very high-risk move because the attack from the rear involved a long advance march through the desert with very little fuel. I mean, there were lots of things that could have gone wrong. If you had balanced this out and said, these are the things that could go wrong, and should I do it or not? Most normal people would say, no, you shouldn't do it. You should actually just attack at the front and see whether you can get away with it.
It sounds a little Lawrence of Arabia to me.
There's a little bit of Lawrence of Arabia, the same sort of approach. Slim he had no natural predilection for vainglorious assaults. So let me just talk you through this. Most soldiers, when confronted with a military problem, will say, I can solve this with force. So if I've got an enemy out there with 100 tanks and 10 aircraft, what you then say to yourself is, well, I need 200 tanks and 20 aircraft. If I've got force, if I've got a preponderance of power, I can defeat the enemy. And you will defeat the enemy, all things being equal, because you've got the extra force. Although it will cause damage to your side, you will lose blood and treasure as a consequence. Slim never looked at it like that. Slim, when he was presented with this question of 100 tanks, he would say, what I will do is I will destroy all of the fuel bowsers feeding the tanks. If I can destroy the fuel bowsers by going behind them or attacking them by air or using mortars, artillery, or doing something else, I'm not going to threaten the meat of my resources. I'm going to do something that destroys the enemy's strength. So the idea that Slim always had right from the beginning was attack the enemy's vulnerabilities, not necessarily weaknesses, but where is the enemy vulnerable? And he did this in Deir ez-Zor, and he did it spectacularly. The enemy were not expecting it. The enemy commander was expecting Slim to come out of the desert on the Euphrates side, and he would just they would have a conventional battle.
That part sounds Napoleon. That's, attack them where they don't think I'm going to attack. Line of communication, supply lines, go after that.
Well, some of your listeners will know the Boyd loop. It's a fantastic theory. I think it works very well. It came from a Sabre pilot, I think, in the American Air Force in Korea, who always realized that when getting into a dogfight with a MiG, if you were able to predict what the enemy was going to do and you went first, then you would discombobulate the enemy and you could get into his decision-making cycle, called the Boyd loop. And Slim was an exponent of this long before Boyd existed, and certainly long before he was flying in Korea, which is try to use this unsettling of the enemy, try to identify what they're going to do, and then preempt them or do something to deny them the fruits of that opportunity. And this is really the story of, without leaping ahead too far, what he did in Burma. I mean, he really did show his spectacular strategic conception of war in Burma in a way that really embarrassed the Japanese every time they came up against each other.
Well, it didn't start off that way.
It is interesting because, we talk about the catastrophic British retreat in 1942. But we need to remember, John, that the British Army was safely gathered up by Slim and marched out of Burma in a fighting retreat, and it wasn't broken up by the Japanese. And in that process of that 100-day retreat over 900 miles, quite an extraordinary feat in itself, a fighting withdrawal, the Japanese were unable to destroy the Burma Corps, what Slim was commanding, and they were able to push the Allies out of Burma. Yes, so that was a really strategic success for the Japanese, General Aida, absolutely no doubt. But they weren't able to defeat them in every battle. After the first two battles, which was the Setang Bridge and Rangoon, they won skirmishes. They didn't. So even places like Yanangjiang, which is a significant battle on the Irrawaddy with the Chinese army, the Japanese very nearly won that battle, but Slim was able to extricate his men. And the point I'm making here is that Slim knew that his purpose was to keep his force in being. A little bit like Jutland and the Royal Navy. It's really, really important that it didn't matter how many ships were sunk, but the Royal Navy had to remain a force in being, because the most important thing strategically in Jutland was ensuring the success of the blockade of Germany. It's the same with Slim. Slim knew that he had to keep his force together. There was no point throwing his men into fruitless battles against the Japanese where they'd all get slaughtered, because he knew there was a second chapter in this book. When he got out of Burma in March 1942, just say that it was the longest retreat in the British Army's history, 900 miles in 100 days. But he got out and they got into Imphal, capital of Manipur, the Indian princely state, and he looked at himself and his men and he said, we can beat these Japs. We've done it before in the couple of battles in Burma. All I need is time. Give me the men, and we will rebuild the army. And you know what, John? That's exactly what he went and did.
Yeah, and please, audience, forgive me. Another analogy that it kind of reminds me of is George Washington, who lost a lot to the British, but he knew that he traded space for time. And as long as he kept his army out there, it was a problem for the British.
And the British never understood this. They thought at the time that this was this was a war of battles. Look. No war is a war of battles. You can win every battle and lose the war. In fact, John, this is the story of the Japanese in the Second World War. I would say that they were good at battles. In fact, they were very good at battles, but they were bad at war because they didn't understand that war has a prescribed outcome. What are you fighting for? You're fighting to topple the Japanese imperial ambitions or whatever. And you might lose battles. That's insignificant if you then win the war. And if Aida in 1942 was able to capture Burma, but not defeat the British, all he had done was created a problem. He now had to occupy Burma. He now had to defend Burma, and he didn't have the troops to do it. And actually, although Aida had a lot of vision, thereafter, 1942 was the high point of Japanese military success. Thereafter, everything about Japanese operations in the Far East became suboptimal. They lost their ability to think strategically. They thought that if they simply fought another battle, they would be successful and things would go their way. And it's quite embarrassing. I mean, I'm writing another book now on the big battle of Kohima in 1944, and it's embarrassing to see and to unravel the Japanese mistakes. Well, we don't have time for that now. Maybe another occasion.
Yeah, another occasion. So yeah, we talk about the British. They did have to retreat out of Burma, and Slim takes over the 14th Army and begins rebuilding morale, discipline, and confidence. How does he do this?
He does it really scientifically. He says, what do I need to have a successful army? And he came up with three building blocks of a successful army. He needed an army that believed in itself, so it had a spiritual purpose. It needed an intellectual purpose as well. It needed to understand how to defeat the enemy. And one of the big challenges in 1942 is that for 20 years, the British and the Indian armies, and indeed the Burma army, because they're all separate, had not prepared to fight the Japanese. And the Japanese came storming in between December 1941 and May 1942 and completely shocked everyone. The idea developed very quickly that the Japanese soldier was a Superman. Slim said, I need to remove the Superman myth. I need to persuade my soldiers that they can fight in the jungle, that they can fight against the Japanese, and they can be successful. And the third one was material. We need to have the proper equipment to do the job. I need artillery. I need automatic weapons. Just to give you an example, a British battalion in 1941-42 had between 6 and 9 Lewis guns in the Far East. Lewis gun has 49-round magazine. They were old First World War weapons. Every single Japanese section had a automatic weapon, had a light machine gun. And there were many Indian soldiers in 1942 who came across the Japanese army for the first time, also came across automatic weapons for the first time. They'd never even heard an automatic weapon before they ended up engaging the Japanese in battle. Now, all of that need to be solved. So moral, spiritual, intellectual, material. The moral and the spiritual are one. And Slim built up a really scientific foundation for this, very well detailed in his account of the war called Defeat into Victory. And it's very, very impressive. Now, in order to be able to achieve all of that, just give you some examples of the things he did. The 14th Army was the bottom of British priorities and American priorities, this being a coalition war after December 1941, right at the bottom for all the priorities, which were, of course, going to fight Germany first and indeed fighting the Pacific. So they had to make do with what they could scrabble around and create themselves. But in the first place, for soldiers, a very, very rigorous training program was put in place. So just if I told you now that Indian soldiers were recruited, it was the largest volunteer army in the history of humanity. 2.5 million Indians decided to volunteer and join up, mainly to fight the Japanese. Quite an extraordinary testament to their determination. Whilst they were part of the British Empire, they also knew that the British Empire was going to end soon, and they didn't want the Japanese ruining their futures. So that's why they joined up in the main. But an infantry soldier would undertake 9 months of basic training. Just think about that, 9 months. When I joined the army in 1981, I did 6 months of basic infantry training, and I thought at the end of it that I was the warrior to beat all warriors. These Indian soldiers did 9 months. They then went home to their villages for a month, met their families, wore their uniforms, and all that sort of stuff. A really important way of linking the army to the families right across India. And by the way, these are soldiers recruited right across India. Before then, Indian soldiers tended to be recruited from the northwest, from the Punjab, and so on. They were known as the Marshal races. Not anymore. Slim and the Commander-in-Chief India, Auchinleck, broke all that down. At the end of that 9 months and the month away home, they came back. They then did 2 final months of jungle training. So think about that. All those Indian soldiers recruited in 42 and 43 who went on to fight in 44 and 45, and fight magnificently, by the way, quite extraordinary, had undertaken 11 months of training. Many years ago when I was doing my PhD in 1999, I was in a little town called Guwahati on the Brahmaputra Valley, and I was interviewing this old guy who had served in the Indian Army. And I said, what was it like? Sort of typical naive question. What was it like? He looked at me and he said, it was easy. He said, well, we'd done all this jolly training. We were desperate to finish the training and go and do the job. He said, we were lying in the trenches on the Shenam Saddle, which is a big ridge of mountains going between the Chindwin and Manipur. And he said, we would see the Japanese from miles off, but they would get out of their trenches and make a big din. And then they would come rushing across the open ground before us, and we would pick them all off. And he said, we never lost a position. This is through the monsoon in 1944, because we were confident in our training. Just as an aside, the Indian Army introduced the idea of battlefield inoculation. Right? Anyone who's been through recruit training in the American Army will know this with the Marines. We do it in the British Army as well, which is you inoculate people to the sound and noise of battle. You crawl under machine guns firing above your heads. You throw live grenades. You know what it's like before you even get to it, because when you do get to the real thing, you realize it's just battle, it's just noise, it's above your head, and it's going to hurt the other guy, not you. You just get on with what you need to do, and that was introduced in the army, and they loved it. It was incredibly important. I mean, one of the big challenges in '42 is if you're a young Indian soldier and you've had 9 weeks training, and then you're exposed to automatic weapons. How do you deal with it? So you solve all those problems in training.
If I had 11 months of training, I'd feel like Achilles or Hector. I'd be like, let's go.
Exactly right. And that was the case. That was the case. And then the phrase of the time was they went into battle with their tails up because they knew they could defeat the Japanese. Now, very, very interesting aside here. Slim sort of almost choreographed some of the early battles. February 1944, there's a series of battles at a place called Northern Arakan, at a place called Sinswaya. And Slim would arrange for company attacks to take place on section positions. So you'd have 100, 150 men attacking a position that might have a handful of Japanese, and you'd have a battalion attacking a platoon position, and you'd have a brigade attacking a company position. And this was all deliberately done in order to be able to give the soldiers a sense of superiority.
Yeah. There's another example that shows, in my opinion, his focus on the little things to make the big things easier. He revolutionized jungle warfare by emphasizing training, health, logistics, and air supply. Slim also noted 70% malarial rates among his troops, largely because they refused to take the foul-tasting anti-malarial medicine. Slim placed the responsibility on his officers. He wrote, quote, "Good doctors are no use without good discipline. More than half the battle against disease is fought not by the doctors, but by the regimental officers," end quote. And he would dismiss officers that had high unit malaria rates. The others realized he was serious, and the malaria treatment was enforced, dropping the rate to less than 5%. This is fantastic.
It is fantastic, and it worked brilliantly well. In fact, Slim sacked. So he's the army commander. So he's the lieutenant general. He's got an army. He's got 2 corps under him with 6 or 8 divisions, and he sacks commanding officers of battalions, which is really extraordinary. And he does it to send a message, which is the point that I made right at the start. Military discipline, the little things, are the things that will save you. And you're absolutely right. In 1942, 75% of all troops operating in this theatre caught malaria. Now, at the time, the mepicrine, the drug designed fantastically to kill the malaria in your bloodstream, it only came in about 1943, I think. And in order to be effective, you had to take it every day, but it turned your skin yellow. You looked a little bit jaundiced. And a myth, a rumor went around the 14th Army that it caused infertility. So the boys refused to take it. You know what boys are like. The soldiers said, "I'm not going to risk my chance of not firing blank." So they didn't take it. And Slim said, every day you need a malaria parade. The whole battalion needs together. Officers need to supervise the consumption of the malarone, which means that, you'd put it in your mouth, and then the officer need to certify the soldier had taken a swig of water and swallowed the drug and not put it under their tongue and took it out afterwards, which happened all the time. And you could spot this because units that took malarone, the malaria rates dropped dramatically. But in addition to all of that, there are a whole series of basic military preventative measures, like rolling down your sleeves in the evening, and also introducing DDT for the first time. This part of the world is probably one of the most malarious in the world. There's a part called the Kabul Valley, which is where much of the fighting took place in 42, and also part in 43 as well, certainly in 44. And the place in 1944 was covered in DDT. So which killed the malaria. I mean, it might have killed a few other things as well, but it definitely got rid of malaria. So there's a whole series of additional things. But actually, military discipline was the first and most important thing that actually solved this problem. Bearing in mind that for the Indian soldier, it's not so difficult. You're a volunteer. If you're a British soldier, you're not a volunteer. Most British soldiers weren't volunteers. They'd been conscripted by this time. And so they're a bit arsy about it, frankly, and didn't take to being told what to do. One of the other things that units did, if you got cerebral malaria, it meant that the mosquito was laying eggs in your brain, and you could be dead in a couple of hours. And a number of regimental medical officers, when they came across someone with who died of cerebral malaria, would take the top of the skull off and show the boys what this did to your brain. And people immediately started doing as they were told. I've read of a couple of occasions where the commanding officer said, the medical officer in Imphal, for instance, went to the commanding officer and said, I've got a cerebral malaria death. And the commanding officer said, well, show me. And he said, I want all my soldiers to see this. The precautions that you need to take are tiny compared to the threat of dying of cerebral malaria. I think the other thing I just need to say, John, is people need to remember the monsoon. Because between May and October in this part of the world, the monsoon comes. And the monsoon drops between 300 and 500 inches. Just as a comparison, in the UK, we get something like 30 inches of rain a year. This is 300 to 500, so 10 to 20 times as much. And it all comes in that 5-month period between May and October. So when you're fighting, I mean, one of the biggest challenges Slim came up with was, do we continue fighting in the monsoon? Because in the old days, campaigning stopped, and Slim said, no, we will keep on fighting through the monsoon. And people laughed at him and said that's not possible. But of course, he did. And it's like most things. If you've got a way, a mechanism for delivering and doing things, it gets easy. And you just needed to have effectively what we call in the British Army a wet weather program. You need to know how to manage your wet weather. And it works.
Yeah. Another thing you touched on was the theory of Japanese forces being invincible, superhuman. So Slim had to counter this widespread psychological fear. He insisted on offensive patrolling and night training to encourage his soldiers to lose their fear of the jungle. And I thought this was interesting. He would bypass smaller, isolated units of Japanese because he knew they would fight to their death, and he didn't want to grind down his army, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this goes back to my point about thinking strategically. If you go into a campaign and you know that what you want to do is build a bridge over the Chinwen, because building a bridge over the Chinwen is going to enable a whole division to cross and go into the heart of the enemy. What you don't want to do is engage every little Japanese position all the way to the Chinwen, because you're going to end up in the Chinwen with nowhere to build the bridge. So this is about thinking sensibly and strategically as a commander. What battles do I need to fight, and what battles do I not need to fight? Now, the Japanese, by contrast, were very bad at this. And this was partly due to the Japanese concept of Bushido, their warrior myth. And the idea of the warrior myth was that in order to exhibit your valor as a samurai, as an inheritor of the samurai tradition, you needed to fight battles to get blood on your sword, on your katana, and particularly as an officer. So a Japanese officer would never go into battle with anything other than his sword. And it would be dishonorable to an extent not to come out of battle without at least some blood on it. So if you come out of a battle without some blood, then you need to find a way of putting blood on your sword, which is why so many prisoners were killed and so many bodies had bayonet slashes on them, because soldiers would come up and slash their bayonets. So if you're a soldier and you don't have a katana, you have a sword at the end of your rifle, your bayonet. And that's why many Japanese soldiers saw the bayonet to be their expression of their physical fact that they were samurai. And when they came across a British or an Indian or a Burmese position, they would more often than not, fight that battle. And this is particularly the case in a famous battle called Jasami, which started on the 28th of March 1944. Japanese division in the invasion of India was going to Kohima. Its role was to get to Kohima as quickly as it could, because once it got to Kohima, it closed the main road from the Brahmaputra Valley into Manipur. Really, really critical strategic task that was given to Sato here. They made their way through the jungled mountains of a place called the Somra Tracks over the Chinwen, crossing east to west, and then came across a number of British outposts, quite small British outposts. And one of them was that place called Jasami. And the Japanese stopped to fight them. What a very stupid thing to do. You should mask Jasami, ignore them, just leave them alone. Get to Kohima as quickly as you can. No, no, no. They spent 5 days trying to reduce Jasami. And just as Jasami was going to fall, the fantastic commanding officer of the battalion there, the 1st Battalion, the Sam Regiment, withdrew, the chap called Bruno Brown, withdrew his men through the jungles at night. They managed to get back to Kohima and were there in Kohima before the Japanese even managed to get there. Completely stupid tactics, all driven by this need to fight battles. Now, Slim wasn't that stupid. Do not fight unnecessary battles. It's one of the things that needs to be drummed. I mean, I've taught this for many years to soldiers and so on. And I experienced this when I was a soldier myself. You need to learn when to fight battles and when to bypass and ignore them. And masking is actually quite a relatively simple thing to do. You could leave a couple of snipers there to keep the enemy's heads down. Don't fight a battle if it's not necessary.
Yeah, and that's always a question. Is like, which battles do you really go all in on, and which ones do you kind of mask and bypass? So I think that's a great point.
Exactly.
Well, under Slim's leadership, Allied forces won decisive victories at
Kohima and Imphal, yes.
Kohima is considered the Stalingrad of the East. What happened here?
Well, the Japanese decided to invade India in 1944, an operation called Operation Ugo under the 15th Army, chap called Motoguchi Renya. I don't have time to tell you the whole story. It is an absolutely fascinating one. Motoguchi Renya had a brilliant strategic brain. And Motoguchi said, we need not to defend Burma, but to send a big pincer into the Brahmaputra Valley. Because if we are able to do this very quickly, we'll be able to destabilize the Allies in the Brahmaputra Valley. In the Brahmaputra Valley, we had the Hump airlift. This is a massive, massive American airlift to China. If I can destroy the airfields, then China is no longer in the war, and I've achieved a great victory. And if I strike at the British and Indian supply depot at Dimapur, which is 58 square miles, it's 37,000 acres of stores, all ready to support a corps advancing into Burma, then they won't be able to go into Burma, and I would have won my battle without a fight. So Motoguchi, brilliant general. I mean, since the war, a lot of people have had a downer on Motoguchi for losing the Battle of Imphal, but his conception was extraordinarily brilliant, and it would have worked in my view. But the Japanese high command by that stage had lost all sense of vision. His boss, a chap called Kawabe, based in Rangoon, and Kawabe's boss, Count Tarachi, based first in Singapore, then Saigon, and Tojo, who of course was the prime minister and actually minister of war at the same time, all wanted to restrict Motoguchi's vision. So they gave him a consolation prize, which is effectively attacking Imphal. Now, Imphal is the capital of the princely state of Manipur. It's just on the western side of the Chindwin. So the whole concept was, let's move from defending Burma on the east side of the Chindwin to attacking Manipur. We'll capture Manipur easily, and we'll hold that. That will be our future defense line. A very, very stupid concept, because it just stretched the Japanese out unnecessarily. It was an unnecessary campaign. And as I'm writing and trying to demonstrate in my current book, it was basically brought about by hubris. It was brought about by trying to placate Motoguchi, who was desperate to achieve his great strategic feint into the Brahmaputra Valley. Anyway, it failed. 100,000 Japanese crossed into Manipur. Slim withdrew his troops all the way back into Manipur itself and to Imphal, and fought the Japanese brilliantly. One of the other mistakes that Motoguchi made, because he just assumed the British would collapse, was he divided his army. He had 3 primary maneuver divisions. He divided them into 6 columns. So he didn't concentrate his force. Big mistake as a general. Concentrate your force at the point of the enemy's greatest vulnerability. Very Napoleonic concept, but he absolutely messed up, which meant each of those 6 columns had to fight their own battles, unsupported or unsustained by each other. And they were bitter battles. And look, the Japanese knew how to fight. They fought to the death. But ultimately, they were defeated. The Stalingrad of the East is a really apt phrase, actually, because Kohima is the little Naga village that sits on the road 134 miles between Imphal and Dimapur. It sits on the top of the pass. It's the only place you can get into India. And a very small group of 1,500 men held that pass for 3 weeks. Those 1,500 men included 446 men of a British territorial battalion called the Royal West Kents. But it also included 1,000 men of the Assam Regiment and the Assam Rifles, Indian soldiers. And they fought from the 4th of April to the 20th of April against 20,000 Japanese and refused to give in. I mean, they were ultimately reduced to a small area of 300 by 350 yards on the tennis court at Kohima. This is the great tennis court battle. Before they were relieved by men of the British 2nd Division coming up, who then had to fight until the 3rd of June to push the Japanese off. But this is the point. Sato, who commanded that division at Kohima, didn't need to fight the battle. He could have masked Kohima and gone on to Dimapur, these 58 square miles, massive dumps of food and fuel and ammunition, unprotected. And he would have secured the greatest victory of the war. And it would have pushed the British and the Americans out of the Far Eastern Campaign at a stroke. Just look at the strategic opportunity. But no one had the vision in the Japanese army to actually pick this up and run with it and make a success of it. And as a consequence, they gave Mutaguchi a suboptimal task, a task that he was only going to fail at. And the Japanese did fail. The Japanese were then pushed back into Burma. They lost about 90% of their men, many of them starving. The Japanese called the retreat back from Kohima the Road of Bones.
Yeah, and I think this stat pretty much sums it up well. In March 1944, they had 150,000 soldiers available to invade India. It was said that they were all dead by July 1944, so basically 4 months later, and Slim had inflicted the largest defeat on the Japanese to that point.
It's absolutely right. And I think the really interesting thing about this is that if you look at all the armies, the formed up armies in the field that the Allies had to fight, the most successful defeats of armies in the field were probably Imphal and Kohima in 1944. A year later, which we'll come on to, at Mektila and Mandalay, quite an extraordinary, quite an astonishing victory that Slim achieved over the Japanese. We must also remember General Zhukov's fantastic defeat of the Japanese in August 1945 in Manchuria, because that particular campaign was a really, really extraordinary one. And the Japanese actually in battle, as formed up armies, they have this formidable reputation of staying and dying. That doesn't mean you're good at fighting. It doesn't mean you're good at maneuver. One of the things that I've become convicted by is the reality that Japanese soldiers died because of the failure of their commanders. Command didn't work, so Japanese soldiers were just sent in under the veil of Bushido to die and to no avail.
Yeah. Slim's army then, after stopping them in India, launches a successful offensive that reconquers Burma in 1945. So how did he accomplish this Herculean task? Because I was reading about it. He had a supply line of elephants, used combined arms offensives with tanks and artillery working together. It seems very General MacArthur, like you lost the territory, now you're reconquering.
Well, I mean, the extraordinary thing I said at the start, I mean, he had to make do and mend. He had no resources. So when Slim in June 1944, at the height of the Battle of Kohima and Imphal, was looking at the prospect of defeating the Japanese in Burma, he said, well, how do I get across the Chindwin? And how do I get across the Irrawaddy? These are two of the largest rivers in the world. I mean, I've been on both and many times. They're shockingly big. And Slim didn't have any boats. So he said, okay, we're going to build our own boats. So at a place called Kaliwa on the Chindwin in December 1944, the 14th Army, his army, built the Kaliwa Boat Factory. They created sawmills. They chopped down teak forests. They built, listen to this, John, 550 10-ton barges. Coated them with pitch, which is bubbling up through the ground in this part of the world, lots of oil. When I first went to Burma in 1997, I was on a boat on the Irrawaddy, and the guy who was looking after me said, oh, Rob, see those teak barges coming down the Irrawaddy? I said, yes. He said, they were built by Bill Slim in 1944. So 550. So they just, and now I've got to give you another example, is Slim's great masterstroke into Burma effectively was not to send his whole army against Mandalay, but to divide his army, but pretend that he was attacking Mandalay, whereas what he was doing is he was taking a whole armoured corps, the 4th Indian Armoured Corps, and shoving it up the Japanese backside at a place called Mektila, crossing the Irrawaddy and striking at Mektila with a whole armoured corps. It was really, really quite extraordinary. How do you get an armoured corps? We're talking about 250 tanks, from a place called Tamu. It's 300 miles through the jungle without a road. 20th of December 1944, he decided to build a road behind bulldozers. So all the tank transporters and everything followed these bulldozers through the jungle under the canopy of trees for 300 miles till they came out at a place called Nyangu and then stormed across the Irrawaddy. Unbelievable chutzpah. I mean, it really is. But he knew his army could do it. They knew that, and all the boys going on the fourth Indian Armored Corps trek through the jungle, they all knew this was a bit of a wheeze. They actually they would laugh about it. They say, if we can pull this off, we're really going to show the Japanese who the master of strategy is, and it's not them. Actually, to cut a long story short, the Battle of Mektila was astonishingly effective. Yes, combined arms tactics, Sherman tanks by this stage, fantastic fighter ground attack, all coordinated, mobile artillery using American Priest guns, 105mm guns, and infantry and kangaroo carriers as well. So it's all of a sudden, over this period of 1943, early 1944, the Indian Army, because it's primarily an Indian Army, has been trained to deliver combined arms maneuver against the Japanese, which is still fighting the way it had fought in 1942. Really, really quite astonishing stuff.
That is. And obviously, the Allies win World War II. And Slim was promoted to Field Marshal in 1949 in recognition of his wartime achievements. And I wanted to ask you about this. What were his relations like with his rank and file soldiers?
Absolutely superb. His soldiers loved him. In fact, right from the beginning, they called him Uncle Bill. In fact, the Indian soldiers called him Uncle Bill. Chacha Slim Saab. So in Hindi for uncle, Chacha Slim. And the English soldiers then copied it and called him Uncle Bill. He was very approachable. He wasn't matey, don't get me wrong. He wasn't matey, but he was very approachable. There's a very funny occasion when he was standing giving a talk to some soldiers, and one of the British soldiers yelled out and said, "We're right behind you, General." And Slim looked at him and said, "No, you won't be. I'll be 300 miles behind you." There's none of the silliness about leading from the front and charge. But the boys loved him, and I've interviewed hundreds of Burma Star veterans, and goodness gracious me. I put a notice in the 14th Army organization called the Burma Star magazine many years ago, saying I was doing a PhD on Bill Slim, and if anyone would like to write to me and tell me their experiences of Bill, please do so. I had well over 1,200 letters. I mean, that's unbelievable. And they all said, we worshipped him. We worshipped the ground he walked on.
Well, I think this next part is interesting. Most generals don't accept their mistakes and what they've learned from them, and we're going to talk about that in his memoirs. He serves as Governor General later in life of Australia and wrote a book that's regarded as a classic military memoir, Defeat into Victory, because he candidly talks about his mistakes and lessons he learned. Most generals don't like, even Wellington didn't like to accept any kind of errors on his part. It was usually subordinates.
Particularly, Wellington's a really good example of someone who would never talk to someone if they ever accused him of making a mistake. Slim was as I said at the outset, a very unusual man, and Defeat into Victory was one of the extraordinary, it is definitely the best general's book of the Second World War, because he acknowledges his mistakes, and when he makes a mistake, and he wrote this in 1956, he pointed out that it was his soldiers and their professionalism and their perseverance that rescued him from his errors. And he made a number of significant errors. The first and foremost was failing to defend Kohima. I mean, he really was caught out by Kohima. He didn't take the Japanese attack seriously. And by the time the Japanese had arrived, he'd very, very nearly lost. And he won that battle because of the remarkable sacrifice of these 1,500 Indian and Brits who just stood there like rocks drift and refused to be moved. They absolutely refused to move, dead and dying, piling up around them, but they stayed firm. And Slim pays testament to that courage and that sacrifice in this book. But he then, when he came home, he then retired or resigned from the army and joined an organization called British Rail, and was the deputy chairman of British Rail for a few years. Until 1949, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, a chap called Clement Attlee, it was time to replace the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, so the head of the British Army, who at the time was General Montgomery. And Montgomery went to Clement Attlee and said, my replacement needs to be appointed. I've decided who it should be, and it's General Crocker. And Clement Attlee said, no, it's not going to be Crocker, it's going to be Slim. And Monty didn't really know Slim very well, said, but I've told Crocker. And Clement Attlee looked at him and said, untell him. Slim then became chief of the Imperial General Staff, sort of 1st of January, early January 1950, and remained so for a very, very important period of time, not least of all during the Korean War. And quite a remarkable man, because one thing I wanted to get across in this chat, John, is how strategically he thought about everything. And you need a strategic thinker. You don't want a tactician as the head of the army. You want a strategist who can understand what the political imperatives of the time are, and who can then employ his skills and talent as a leader of the army to achieve them. And he did that remarkably well.
Yeah, yeah. Passes in 1970, and I wanted final question to ask you about his legacy, because he doesn't get the notoriety of Patton or Monty or Eisenhower. What do you think his legacy is?
Well, I'll just say that when I was doing the PhD, I was at Staff College in the British Army when I decided I was going to do this PhD, because no one at Staff College knew anything about Slim. And I thought this was bizarre. I'd actually ended up a few years before going to Staff College teaching a course on the Burma Campaign. And I thought this is quite extraordinary that we, as a British Army, has completely forgotten this great man and what he managed to achieve, and went away and did the PhD. And I think one of the reasons, and I thought about this for all the years since, why is Slim not better known? It's because he was not a self-publicist. Old Monty would bang on about how great he was from every soapbox he could climb onto. And everyone knew who Monty was, good or bad, because he told them. Not so Slim. Slim was self-deprecating. He was retiring. He wasn't shy, but he wasn't retiring. He would never be a politician. He was not there to bang a drum. And he had this phrase. He said, "Victory is all the music I need." And that might sound marvelous, and it is true, but the sound doesn't continue through history. You need something more than that. He was one of the last century's greatest generals in Britain and the Empire. He achieved extraordinary success in Burma when no one in London ever expected victory to be achieved. Churchill never regarded victory to be possible. He described going into Burma as akin to jumping into the sea to wrestle with a shark. Only stupid people did it. Slim went in and defeated the Japanese. He unstitched them perfectly.
You make a good point. He wasn't a self-promoter like Monty or Patton, but also, was it the theater he was operating in? Like, that's not Europe.
Yes, you're right. You're right. The boys in the 14th Army called themselves the Forgotten Army because they were a long way from home. When they get newspapers 6 weeks after the event, they would read the newspapers and all they'd hear about was Italy and Northern Europe, and nothing about them. So they regarded themselves as forgotten. Slim did a lot of work to actually remedy this, but it's very interesting to see how they, out of sight, out of mind. I mean, I've described him as the forgotten general of the forgotten army and the forgotten war, and that probably encapsulates it all.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the overview of him. It sounds like a fascinating man. Again, if you want to learn more about Slim, please check out Robert's book, Slim, Master of War, or his website, robertlyman.com. And yeah, this is great. We appreciate your time.
I've absolutely loved it. I always love talking about Slim. I mean, the final thing I'll say, if I can, is that, I mean, the British Army's doctrine of combat is called maneuver warfare. It's the same as the Americans, exactly the same idea. Slim was the master of it. Slim actually came up with many of the basic tenets of maneuver warfare long before anyone else did in the British Army. And if you want to try to understand what this really encapsulates, it's all about using your mostest to attack the enemy's leastest.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's what we should end on. So yeah, thank you always, Robert. This is a brilliant talk. Yeah, if my listeners would like to learn more, please check out his website or his books on Amazon. We thank you for your time, sir.
John, it's been an amazing pleasure. Thank you very much.